Hello, everyone. Can you take your seats, those of you who are still with us, which is fantastic. And obviously, thinking about the Cinderella subject in medicine of mental health, we're quite used to coming last. We were the latest of all of the new medical specialties. Mental health, of course, some of you will be aware of that. We used to be known as society's policemen because there were no drug treatments for mental ill health, and people were put in large asylum, primarily built on prison architecture plans and in faraway places, just like prisons still are in the UK. And so it's great to see so many people still here. We're going to be fairly informal. I'm going to start by introducing myself, and then the panel members will introduce themselves. And I'll give you a little bit of a running order then. So my name is Kathryn Abel. I'm a clinical academic based in Manchester. I am also very honoured to co-chair one of the government's mental health goals program, one of the healthcare goals programs, the mental health care goals program. And that was one of their 5 priority health missions, as were. But now the new government has its own missions. We are now remonikered as goals programs. And the overarching aim of those programs is really to try to drive better health through innovation. And that means we're very much industry focused, and we want to make a step change, really shift the dial for how research gets done and make the best use of incredible life sciences in the UK. And I would specifically highlight fantastic interlinked and depth of data that we have as a result of the NHS, where 98% of people in the UK are registered with their GPs and therefore registered in the NHS systems. So that's my background, and if all of you can come, let's start with you, Andrew, and then we'll just run through the panel.
Thanks, Kathryn. Andrew Grill, I'm a futurist, and Kathryn before said she didn't know what I did. I make the highly complex easy to understand and accessible.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
Wow, that was quick. My name's Kathryn Owen Adams. I am the CEO of a pharmaceutical company in the US called Acadia Pharmaceuticals. As you can probably tell, I don't hail from the US. I started life here at Manchester University as a pharmacist. Spent about 10 years of my pharma career here in the UK before I went to the US about 20 years ago. I've worked for most of my career in very large pharma, Johnson & Johnson and Bristol Myers Squibb, and only very recently moved to small biotech. So I'm experiencing the differences right now.
Great, and it's lovely. I haven't met you before, Kathryn, so it's very nice. But Vanessa I've known for many years.
Thank you. I'm Vanessa Pinfold, and I'm the co-founder and research director of a small mental health research charity in the UK. I'm the Pin of McPin, and we really focus on lived experience expertise and putting that at the heart of mental health research. So this morning, people talked about the science of public engagement. We're all about developing the science of public engagement.
Thanks, Vanessa. Sanket, again, I haven't met you before, so lovely to meet you today.
Nice to meet you as well. Well, good afternoon. I'm Sanket Shah. I actually have the privilege of leading Otsuka Precision Health, which is a subsidiary of the broader Otsuka Holdings organization, really thinking about how do we transform the health experience, bringing high tech and high touch together to help both mental health patients, but really individuals across their journey.
And Mike, I've known particularly because he has been a fantastic support in the original mental health mission. He's now leading the mood disorder network, clinic network there. So Mike, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yep, thank you. I'm Michael Browning. I'm a professor of computational psychiatry in Oxford. I did spend some time as an undergraduate in the sprawling metropolis of Cambridge, but I've gone over to the other side now. And I run clinical trials in depression, and I run a research clinic for people with difficult to treat depression. So that's my area.
Thanks so much. So I'm just looking at the title because I sort of realised that I wasn't particularly focused on the actual question we've been asked, but I think we will be able to cover it very broadly. So it says, how can healthcare systems deliver solutions at scale to address the global mental health crisis? And what we're really talking about here today is common mental disorder, and that's mood disorders. And common mental disorders are orders of magnitude more common in the population globally than the rarer ones, which have actually had far more attention from the pharmaceutical industry. Probably, you know, when I grew up at the Institute of Psychiatry, schizophrenia was the disorder that you sort of thought about, and certainly the pharma industry was most interested. It was the most, thought to be the most genetic, thought to be the most tractable in terms of a target. It's become very clear that in terms of mood disorder, we've had very, very little innovation in that space, particularly from the pharmaceutical industry, I would suggest, and that many companies have really moved away from innovation in mental health. And we might learn a little bit about what the reasons for that are today, both from the panel but also from you here in the audience. But what I'd like to start to do now is just to start with Mike, actually, and ask you to, because not everybody will know or think a great deal about mental health all the time. Just to sort of, if you like, set the scene for what it's like now in terms of the clinical perspective, the system that you work in perspective for mood disorders.
Great, thanks. Yeah. So we've heard about a bunch of different types of illnesses today, and I think thinking about depression, it's the polar opposite of the rare diseases that you heard about earlier on. So those rare diseases are extremely uncommon, and they're caused by one strong genetic process, right? Depression has got a dappled etiology. There are many risk factors that you can have or not have, and those could be genetic, those could be environmental, they could be situational, okay? Depression is extremely common. If you look at the point prevalence of it, it's in the order of about 7 to 10% at any one time. It's higher in some demographics, so women have it about twice as often as men. If you are chronically unwell with a physical illness and economically inactive, you have an extremely high risk of depression, so there's lots of those sort of social aspects. It's geographically variable. It's higher, particularly in the northwest of England. It's lower in London. So there's lots of variety like that. In terms of the economic impact, so a number of people try and estimate the economic impact of depression. It's enormous. So the latest number was 300 billion a year in the UK. Most of that is lack of productivity, but there's still a large healthcare cost associated with it as well. And so just to think about very quickly about the kind of clinically, how it's dealt with and the approach. Depression has a range of severity. And at its mildest end, it blends in to everyday experience. So many of you will have been depressed or at least know people with mild depression. And as it gets more severe, it becomes, there's fewer people with more severe depression. But at the other end of the spectrum are people who take their own lives very commonly, or people who, for example, just take to bed, stop eating or drinking, don't move anymore, and so that's a medical emergency. Now, they're not treated aggressively, then they die. And so the treatment of depression really reflects that severity. So the great majority of people have milder depression and they're treated in primary care, and they can be treated with behavioral or social interventions, maybe diet or exercise, psychotherapy interventions that the GP can refer patients to. If the illness is more severe or more chronic, sometimes you can use antidepressants. If that doesn't work, then theoretically at least you can refer people into secondary care where they can have other types of treatments that tend to have worse side effects and be more intensive. And at the most severe end of the spectrum, for example, people can have electroconvulsive therapy if they're going to die in a few days without it. So that's the way it's meant to run. Just as a kind of reflection lastly on how it runs in the UK, generally what happens in the UK is you're treated in primary care, and if you don't get any better, you stay in primary care and you never get seen in secondary care. And the access to secondary care in the UK is largely down to risk rather than severity. So a group of patients with depression who are particularly poorly treated in the UK are people who are not trying to kill themselves, but who have symptoms that have not responded to first-line treatments, and they're relatively poorly served in primary care.
Thanks very much. And so, Vanessa, from the patient perspective, how does what Mike says reflect from the patient perspective? And I know you've been fantastic, and actually, you're not just here representing one person, but actually you've undertaken quite a bit of work in order to be here today.
Yeah, I suppose that's the kind of approach we always take. It's very difficult to be the patient representative, particularly on something that is so heterogeneous, a very complex health problem. And as Mike said, everybody in this room, I think, can probably relate to depression. A lot of people will know someone that's on antidepressants, has taken antidepressants themselves, have got friends that have been treated for depression. So in coming here today, I thought, right, okay, I'm going to ask within our networks, within McPin, to see what people wanted me to talk to you about. But in terms of setting the scene and drawing on that, I think one of the key things is the causes are multifactorial, and social determinants of health, it links very much to what the obesity forum was talking about earlier. The really key thing here is that a lot of depression relates to social determinants of health, and so poverty is a really key driver, and trauma. And trauma turns up in different shapes and sizes, and the key thing here is that trauma has a long tail too. So the key thing from the patient community is that we're looking for holistic health and answers that think about the biopsychosocial. And so I think that as a community, we have traditionally, our relationship with industry has been a little bit tricky, but I think that is changing, and we're really open to create new partnerships, new collaborations, and think about bringing the patient voice very, very centred. As leaders, in my organisation, most of my staff work from a lived experience perspective. They live with depression, anxiety, psychosis, mental distress, and they have PhDs, they have master's degrees. They are scientists, they are researchers, but they're also experts in their own lived experience. And we look at ways in which we can try and transform research by bringing that to the fore. It's hard though, not all of my staff want to talk openly about it because of the stigma. And the thing about depression, it kind of underpins one of the great challenges we have, that across the world, there's a lot of people that are living with depression. So we think about what the numbers are in the UK, and one of the key endpoints around depression, and when it's really difficult in that deep darkness, that the hole that you're in, the hopelessness that you're in, when you feel that life's not worth living and you can't make decisions, but you think that one of the options might be self-harm or suicide. 7,000 people take their lives each year in the UK, and across the world that's 700,000. So I think what we're looking at is this massive problem whereby even with the kind of treatments that we know, the evidence base that we have, the side effects of a lot of the solutions are really, really extreme. And so it's a really difficult thing, the risk-benefit analysis of trying different things when you're in that deep hole of despair is really, really challenging. So the picture is complicated. But I think on the whole, what we're looking at is that there's no one-size-fits-all. What we're looking for is psychosocial treatment programs that think about people as a whole. We need to think about the side effect profiles, because as I said, it's really, really challenging, because you solve one problem and you gain another, and sometimes that means multiple medications. The other element of this is the workforce. Across the world, there are very few people who can access treatment, because in the majority of low and middle income countries, there are no psychiatrists, there are no health specialists, there are no physicians to provide people that meet the requirements for depression. In the UK, we also have a workforce crisis. So we have to think about the lack of join-up within our systems of care. We have a lot of hope, we have a lot of energy going into all of this, and I would like to big play out to the funders. So UKRI, Wellcome, and NIHR in this country are really putting the patient voice at the centre of the research process. So we are starting to see these kind of alliances and the kind of change that can happen where we bring these coalitions together. So I think that we are on a hopeful curve. But the key really is this multifactorial, challenging disorder that affects a lot of people in this room.
So just bearing in mind, thanks so much, Vanessa. Given it's late in the afternoon, and I want to keep you all awake on your toes, just put your hand up if you've either had personal experience or somebody in your family or friends you know who's had depression or been treated with depression. I mean, it's virtually everybody. I mean, it's really extraordinarily common, this kind of problem. And I guess I'd like to come to you next, Kathryn, because, of course, we've heard from Tony about the way in which the pharmaceutical industry started to think about, the small molecule. But now, of course, it's thinking about the small cell. And we really don't have that in the way that we've just heard about it from the clinician's perspective and the patient's perspective. So how does that challenge get met by pharma? And what do you see the kind of current state of the art from the pharma's perspective?
So let me try and answer this from a couple of perspectives. So for the last 10 or so years, I've been heavily into oncology, and the innovation we've seen that we've heard about this morning has been amazing. At the same time, we've seen hardly any innovation in mental health, even schizophrenia. The most recent one being in the new product that Bristol Myers Squibb has just launched in the US, the first, I think, for 30 years. So I'm hoping that we're now seeing a renaissance in the interest in mental health across the world, and I think we are. Some of the issues that I'm now facing as the CEO of a small biotech company, but I also faced in larger pharma, is first that regulatory challenges of doing mental health clinical trials are real. It's relatively easy in other therapy areas to have much more objective outcomes to clinical trials. In oncology, we have OS, PFS, etc. Hematology the same, immunology the same. When we move to mental health, it's much more subjective, and we all know about high placebo rates and all the rest of it. And so when you're looking at taking risk, it's just harder to take risk in a trial that you know may have the odds of actually not working out. And as Janet said earlier, randomized control trials in mental health are particularly difficult. When we look at Europe, and specifically the UK, the other real challenge for development is reimbursement realities. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is therefore more drugs being launched in the US than are available in the UK and Europe, and that's the reality of the current reimbursement system. And part of that is to do, I believe, with NICE, and I think Sam has left the room, and my EMA colleagues, being very wedded to an HTA approach, which I think for mental health actually is not the best way of assessing value to society. We can talk about QALYs and the fact the UK hasn't raised its QALY level for 20 years, which in itself has meant it's been devalued by, I think, between 30 and 40%. R&D costs during those same 20 to 30 years have more than tripled, and therefore the whole thing becomes out of whack. The use of EQ5D is not very good for mental health assessment. It doesn't assess many aspects of that, including mental health for the elderly, mental health for teenagers. And so that's this sort of very rigid, and Janet was talking to it, sort of yesterday's approach to assessing every type of outcome with a QALY in mental health is just not very sustainable. And as a result of that, patients at the heart of it are suffering. And especially, I would suggest, in the UK, where there is less choice, there is more convoluted approach to mental health than there is in the United States. I'm the daughter of a mother who's had mental disease for her whole life, has tried to commit suicide 4 times in the UK, and has had 27 ECT treatments, the last of which induced a hemorrhagic stroke. So I have seen the UK healthcare service at its best and worst in terms of treating mental health. I think there are definitely bright spots, but I would also then finally talk to the postcode lottery, whatever we want to call it, because my mother's now in East Yorkshire, and her healthcare is much different than it was when we were in Wimbledon. So again, the UK right now, for me, is a passion project for getting things to a better state, but unfortunately feels a little bit less well served than my patients in the US.
Well, thank you for giving us that very personal account, and it sounds like a difficult experience. And I think, Mike, also, what we see very much, because we have such great data, we can see these regional differences and the health inequalities just within the same region very starkly in the data sets in these common disorders. We can see them very clearly. And I think one of the other things that you bring up is very interesting, and I wonder, you might want to talk to this, Sanket, I don't know, but one of the sort of problems of common disorder is you can often get small effects over the population,
right.
Large effects. So you can get big effects across the population, but the effect sizes are quite small, and sometimes in the RCTs, those effect sizes are very small, and then, of course, the longer out you go with the medications. This is absolutely what we've seen with the antidepressants. The effect sizes get sort of smaller and smaller over time as the population, the clinical population who picks up the treatments, gets more and more heterogeneous and outside the trial rigor. So I think there are some very particular problems in relation to pharmacological developments and the environments in which they're being asked to be placed in common mental disorders like mood disorder. Sanket, do you want to pick up any of those points or talk about, perhaps about digital tech as well as pharma?
Absolutely. So if you think about Otsuka, Otsuka actually has the privilege of having a pharmaceutical side, really the wellness side, but we've actually spun off a digital health side as well. And we are starting to look at different treatments to personalize what I think, Vanessa, you shared are the issues that everyone's going through, access issues, potentially personalizing it. And what we've done, at least at Otsuka, is think about how to address each one of those, not in sort of a single solution, but having multiple solutions across the board. Because what we've learned a little bit over the 40 years of being in mental health, there's no one size that fits all. And we're going to have to create different solutions for different areas and try to take a scalable approach to a lot of this. And that has been sort of the approach that we've taken with digital medicine, Rejoin, which is a digital app that we've actually brought for MDD, but we've taken the same rigor as a drug trial.
MDD, major depressive disorder.
Sorry. And I think that's one thing that we continue to do is we still have to put the same rigor into all of these, but personalizing it so that it actually is something that actually works for each one of us in our own unique ways.
Thanks very much. You brought up the thorny, although opportunistic, issue of heterogeneity. Andrew, can I ask you to finish off the first round before we go to the audience for some initial comments? Any thoughts?
Well, I should have added to my introduction that I actually spoke at the Gallian Forum in Poland, the inaugural one last year, on AI. I did a keynote, so my focus is on AI. I also look across multiple industries. 2 hours ago, I was speaking to the BBC in Wales about AI weather presenters. Now we're talking about using data in mental health. So what I can bring to the discussion is I look at the use of technology across all industries. And what came up a lot in Tony's discussion was data. He also talked about AI, and you mentioned it as well. In many industries, where AI is going to work is because it brings speed and scale. And so in education, we're going to start to see personalised education. So if we then look at mental health and mood disorder, every individual is different. So what I'd like to see is how can we apply new technologies such as AI to this problem? And Tony alluded to it, that the answer is there because the technology is getting smarter and smarter. We actually have the data. We have the ability to not just treat different cases, but also allow people suffering it to be treated in different ways and maybe learn something from that data. And in the years before, we weren't able to trawl through that as fast as we could. An example I give in my talks, who here remembers Where's Wally, the cartoon series? I wondered if AI could find Wally, and I basically uploaded it and it found Wally, it circled it. So the correlation there is, where is that Wally, where is that gold in the data that answers the question and helps solve mental health? Where is our Wally and can we find him?
Fantastic. I thought we'd just give the audience again a bit of participation. Lady at the back, woman at the back. I hate the word lady.
So as someone, sadly, who it wasn't prevented, I've lost a parent to mental health. It's a very interesting area to me. It's very, close to my heart. My question is, it's very complex and some of it's very trauma-based, environmental. How much of it, and I would love to know this from the experts, is genetic and due to neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain? How far are we away from potentially doing a personalized approach like we do more down the line with oncology for psychiatric disorders and being able to be more tailored in which neurotransmitters we can modulate with drugs?
Well, it's a great question because it's brought us on to the next set of discussions. But Mike, why don't you start off with that?
Yeah, that has been a goal for a long time. I think it's probably worthwhile starting off with a slight dampener, okay? I think it's the cancers or the rare diseases that have very strong single genetic drivers are quite well suited to that relatively straightforward, I'd say relatively straightforward, it's not my area, personalization. Causality in mental health is dappled, right? And in all of the illnesses. And so if you look at the amount of variance that's attributable to genetic factors in twin studies, it's higher for things like It's quite high for autism, it's highish for schizophrenia, maybe 60, 70%. When you get to depression, it's about 20 or 30%. So it's quite a low percentage of that. So the idea, particularly in the very common mental disorders, that simply genotyping people will tell you exactly what's going to help them, I think is quite a long way off. There is some work a little bit, so you can do genotyping, for example, the P450 system to look at drug side effects, and so it's not that there is no utility there at all, but there is difficult, certainly, to do it just on the behavioral data. Whether bigger data that includes these environmental factors as well, combined with that, will be more effective is more of an open question. It's never been demonstrated so far, but we haven't had the data to ask that question properly so far. So I think those studies are, everyone's looking at it, and the person that does it will get a Nobel Prize.
They certainly will. Trevor, I think you had a question as well. I'm going to give you this just because I can hear you, but others won't.
Basically the same question, that the word depression to me is like the word cancer. It's a catch-all, and I was wondering what depth of knowledge we have about the genetic base, subgroups of people influence the environment. It's the same question, really. Yeah.
I have a question. I have a comment.
Do make your comment.
Yep, Janet Woodcock. My comment is, we heard from the obesity panel, and now we've heard from this group that basically the healthcare systems, and I'm not impugning the NHS, okay, I'm talking worldwide really, is failing these patients because they need holistic care. There's a huge amount of social factors involved here and other factors. My question is there any thought about rethinking how people are treated with these more common conditions and not using healthcare professionals, because the healthcare system, it's not working?
I mean, can I please just quickly make a comment about that, because I'm so with you on that, although I still think healthcare professionals should be very much involved, but I think we should, what I call randomized care. So I think we should fess up and say, we don't really know what depression is. We can describe it quite accurately and reliably, and that's what the ICD and DSM does. But the degree of heterogeneity, and not only that, but change over time, and multimorbidity that goes along with that, means that it's unrealistic to have a single target, if you like. So I think what we should do is randomize people in care. So you turn up to your physician, primary care, whatever, and you get randomized on the basis that we don't know how to treat this illness. And that brings in a whole range of opportunities, in my view, for example, platform approaches. I'll stop there because I'm sure the panel want to answer, and I know there are a few more questions.
I mean, the one thing I would jump in on with that is that one of the key things that people that I work with experiencing depression talk about is that they need time and they need someone to listen to them. And that does not have to be a medical profession. And one of the interesting things is there's a very big rise in user-led care in the UK, and peer support movement is strong. And so large groups of mental health service users are setting up their own services and getting commissioned by clinical commissioning groups to do so. So there is a lot of progress, I think, within that community. We've also had community transformation programs, and in them there's been innovation, and some of the innovation is giving small micro grants to community groups that are not labelled mental health. It might be the local library, or it might be a faith community, to be able to provide a bespoke walking group or something that might come on social subscription, but what local community think is right for that particular group of people. I know we did some evaluation of a women's cooking group, and it was a group of Asian women who came together to cook and talk, and they all experienced depression, but they didn't talk about it in those terms. So it's about community-led solutions alongside the other elements. But I think there's got to be a big shout out for psychological therapy. So you've got medication, you've got psychological therapy, and then you've got the whole raft of other social interventions. In schools now, we have programs whereby we're really trying to encouraging teachers to increase their mental health literacy and the way they can respond to students, not to become professionals, but because an awful lot of the responses need to be somebody saying, I hear you, and I believe in you, and I'm going to find support with you. So it's about those kind of interactions that are so important within this space.
I'm just going to say, so I'll come to both Sanket and Vanessa to answer that, and then we'll come over there. I can see there's another question over there. So, Vanessa, sorry,
Kathryn.
sorry,
Same as.
looking at Kathryn and calling you Vanessa, elderly brain. Would you like to just address some of the sort of difficult or the challenge that this isn't in the medical sphere at all, and that we shouldn't be asking pharmaceutical industry to innovate for common mental disorder?
I'll sort of touch on that and the question from the lady at the back. So there is definitely innovation in clinical trial design for mental health in terms of looking at better diagnostic modalities and trying to use scans and PET scans, etc., to try and come up with not necessarily genetic, but a better, more objective mapping of the brain to see different types of activity. And that's sort of being driven more from, if you think about, we're moving sort of Alzheimer's and psychosis and biomarkers, and there's a hope that at some point depression may pop up with a biomarker and or a brain scan that we can better use to more objectify outcomes in clinical trials. That all costs money and it's at risk, and it's definitely something that large pharma is looking at and small biotech is looking at as well. And interestingly, venture capital investors who really are the lifeblood of biotech, and 65% of all drug launches start in small biotechs. We must not forget that. They're interested in finding the next GLP-1. So, everybody knows that if somebody can crack the mental health nut, there's a lot of money to be made, and unfortunately, at the end of the day, it does sort of come back to that. So I think there's a lot of innovation that's out there, but I think the digital side of it right now, in terms of that symptom control and that sort of companion therapy, is something that I think is really exciting now for patients. So it's the concomitant use of the digital and the pharmacological. I'm not sure I can talk too specifically about people other than doctors treating. My experience in the UK would be fairly negative from that perspective, but there is always hope.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to answer the one question about communities, I think what we started to see in the US, and I'll talk about inner cities, barbershops is now where a lot of the conversations are happening, and they are actually getting treated there in some ways because they do not want the stigma of sort of being able to sort of talk about this. So I think communities is absolutely where some of at least the diagnosis is starting to happen, and potentially, in some ways, them getting started with some of the treatment. I think from a digital standpoint, as we've launched, we've learned that there is a tremendous amount of individuals that want to get started. But the struggle is they want to know that this is going to work, and that's where they want a healthcare provider in some fashion. So the connection seems to be extremely important in at least this initial phase of trying to see how digital can sort of either complement the drug side of it, or even in some cases be part of the treatment solution. But in the past 6 to 8 months as we've launched, the challenge has been they do want some type of validation with physicians.
I think we'll come on to the sort of regulatory problems with digital, et cetera, endpoints, thresholds, specifically in a bit. I just want to get to, there's another, I think, Simon, do you have a microphone?
Yes, yeah. I do. I came with one. So as a family doctor, I really welcome the destigmatization of mental health problems that's happened over the last 10 years, much of it led by celebrities and royalty and so on. Mm-hmm. But the downside of that is my fear that we're medicalizing sadness at a time when I'm not sure about the relative benefits and harms of the diagnostic label, when the healthcare system, as you've just described, is failing to provide a service for people who are either sad or depressed or have mental health problems.
Thanks. Any other thoughts about that from the panel? Because I think that's a very common, we hear this a lot, can you imagine? Yes, please do.
So I have some sympathy with that, and particularly from a university where the counselling service is utterly overwhelmed with new people that have it. And I think I see people with difficult to treat depression who are quite unwell and have been quite unwell for 20 or 30 years and are really struggling. And they're a much smaller group than the very mild group. But because depression is so common, there's still a big group. And I think the risk is with a very low bar is that we imagine that just having a chat with your mate is enough, and or going for a run, and that will be okay. But there's a group of people that really are quite unwell and with quite a high mortality that we can't lose sight of. And so we need the full range of services, as well as the light touch stuff we've been talking about.
Yes, I think that heterogeneity is incredibly important for us to recognise, and I hope we'll talk about how that might become an opportunity in the future. I think, Carol, you've also got a question.
I have. It's Carol Longson again. We've been talking quite a bit about new interventions and new approaches, new modalities, new drug development, which is absolutely necessary. But there are many interventions that are evidence-based and good value for money that we're still not implementing. And I can remember back at NICE, 2004, I think it was, the first computerized therapy for CBT for depression and anxiety. So it's not as if these things haven't been around for many years. It's not as if we don't know that they work. But the scale at which they're not being used is really, really bad. So I'm wondering if the panel wants to talk about how we change that, how we change to be able to use the things that we already know work.
So there's a tension here, isn't there, between whether or not we encourage the pharmaceutical industry to create expensive new options for people, or whether we use what we've already got for the vast majority of people who've got relatively mild disorder, and we don't really want to medicalise.
It's not mutually exclusive, of course.
No, I think that's right. But Andrew?
So whoever has ever had a bad day at work? We talk, yeah, all of us. We talked before, you gave a number of 300 billion of productivity issues. So you're quite right. Someone has to put up the money to start developing these tools. And I could talk for an hour about how we could use generative AI in a safe way to do that. But what about actually going where the money is? If you're in corporate land, do you want your employees who are having bad days at work, who are suffering depression, do you want them to stay away from work? So why don't we start where the money is? And I know that if you start to use things like wearables, you can start to detect these symptoms. So maybe we've got to start where there's a high value exchange, where employers are saying, we actually want a healthy workforce. If we can start to augment and instrument that in a positive, ethical way, and we can actually go back and say, we can see that you're starting to become a little bit stressed at work, we want to help you there. The other thing I want to talk about is, I hear a lot of young people saying they're now using generative AI as someone to talk to, because if they're having an issue or problem at work or with a relationship, they don't always want to talk about it with their mates. It maybe isn't the safest thing to talk to is to ChatGPT, but imagine a version of ChatGPT that was Health GPT or NHS GPT that had been trained and programmed to give reliable advice and someone to talk to. I think we're going to see a lot more younger people who don't know that they can access care and are asking the question to an AI. The fact that AI has that data, you then have another ethical issue. Could we flag that there are lots of people in this area that are having this same issue, and as an early prevention? So the data is there, but back to my initial point, can we go where the money is in corporate world and help solve corporate issues? Because they need that solved.
Great. Any other comments at this point? Oh, over here.
Kathryn, could I just quickly answer just to comment on the point that you made in terms of, I mean, I think one of the big challenges is that even with AI, people want to be able to speak to a person. And one of the difficulties about why the treatments that we've got that are evidence-based are not into practice is because we just don't have enough people in the workforce to deliver. And the government have launched a big community mental health programme inquiry, and everyone's trotting forward at the moment, giving their evidence about, you know, we know what works, but we haven't got the capacity. The system doesn't seem to be joined up. And the joining up between the voluntary sector, social care, primary care and secondary care is also really important. But we have got a lot of the tools in the toolbox, but it's not coordinated. So I think that's one of the things that we need the new, but we also need to be putting into practice the things that we know that work and that people are asking for. But it's not that easy, and we know that whether it's schools, whether it's in workplaces, or whether it's in the health service, people are struggling with workload or financial pressures, etc., etc. So it feels like there's a systemic kind of crisis at the moment. But at the heart of it, in terms of the delivery of the things that we need, is that we don't have the scale up within the system.
True. Question over there.
Yeah, so talking about innovations in pharma, especially for treatment-resistant depression, we are starting to see in research a lot of stuff on psychedelics. Do you think that as we sort of move forward, that's going to be something that we see opening up as an option, or are we really far away from that?
So I'm going to start with you, I think, here, Mike.
So this is an interesting thing. So it's probably worthwhile doing a little bit of background. So this is a different sort of treatment. It's certainly described in a different way. So as a rule with treatments of depression, you give someone a pill, they take a pill once or twice a day, and then over 3 or 4 weeks they get better, or they have therapy for 6 weeks, they get better, the ECT every day for 12 sessions, and then hopefully they get better. So the psychedelics is you give someone a psychedelic, they become at one with the universe for about somewhere between 15 minutes or 6 hours, depending on the drug you use. And they have such an extreme experience that's important to them that it changes how they feel for a long time afterwards, right? So that's the way. So there's been a lot of debate about what sort of treatment is that. Is it just a drug treatment, or is it a facilitated psychotherapy, or how is it going to be used? And that's going to be important for the relatively mundane reason because it makes it more difficult to license. Okay, so a lot of the psychedelic companies now are moving away from it's facilitated psychotherapy, and they say we just make sure we keep people calm, we make sure they're okay, and then they're at one with the universe. I guess the other thing to say is there's lots of these studies going on. We're involved with one of those studies in Oxford, and so the drugs are quite close to the market, assuming those studies are positive, which they probably will be. But it's going to be a bit of a head scratcher for the implementation in the NHS because it's like it needs a completely different infrastructure to do it. And esketamine is maybe a middle ground for that. So Spravato from Johnson & Johnson that NICE didn't like because it didn't get through the health economic side of things. So we don't have very much of that in the UK at the moment. But it's I think they are probably going to be licensed. I think they will be difficult to access.
Unless you're really wealthy.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say...
I'm talking billionaire wealthy.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the inequities that's... Well, we certainly see it in America right now.
Is that me?
Both of you.
You go first. You're closer to America than I am.
I think I am. I don't know whether I'll answer that, but I'll answer a little bit about the innovation. I think we sort of need to really think hard in England, because Spravato is licensed and reimbursed in Scotland, about, again, how we assess value for money for drugs like Spravato, and it will be the same for the psychedelics. They'll go through the same issue. So, I think that's something that the UK or England needs to reassess, because otherwise patients in England will forever not be able to access these therapies unless they are wealthy, or they can go to a ketamine clinic, or they can find another way to source the drug. In the US, it's much more available because people still pay for insurance. It's not like the US has got any different approach, really. Ultimately, it's still insurance pays for it, but the insurance system there recognizes value beyond the way that NICE currently assesses value, and I think that's maybe the difference. So we'd love to see that evolve and change as the UK tries to evolve and change. But overall, I think the innovations are slow to come in mental health, and we can talk about psychedelics. We've got NMDA, a receptor antagonist. We've got a new approach to GABA, GABA-A. We've got serotonin 1A receptor antagonist. We've got lots of things coming through that I believe will offer promise and new approaches. But unless the UK reassesses its approach to reimbursement, they will not be available on the NHS.
So I'm just going to ask Vanessa to think with us about how patients feel about psychedelics, hallucinogens.
Well, I asked, and 62% of the people that I talked to, 62% said it was promising and 38% were really wary. So I think, like a lot of things, there are different views around it. And one of the points was, how would it scale up? And what would be the support and supervision around it? So a lot of the thing about any new treatment, people want to know who's going to support them to take it, and make sure they've got informed information and they can make the choices that it's the best option for them at that point in time. And psychedelics fitted with that. But we also asked, would they consider taking it? And 54% said yes, 29% said no, and 17% were undecided. So, like all things, it's an option.
Yes, I think that's very interesting.
But, did the patients comment about their doctor's enthusiasm to even support them through that? Because I do wonder whether there's a professional side of that as well. The professional doctors need to be informed, educated, aware, understand the differences in terms of types of patients that could be suitable for each one, because it's both patients need to ask, but also doctors need to feel confident. And again, back to the stressed and overworked workforce here, I just wonder how many of the psychiatrists in secondary care and or the GPs in primary care would feel confident to even have that conversation and say yes, even if it was the right patient in front of them. So again, I think it's more than just the availability, it's also that HCP willingness and confidence and time to spend with the patient.
Any thoughts about that, Mike?
Yeah, so I mean, they're certainly not confident at the moment because there's none available, right? And
here.
Yeah, well, for psychedelics, really anywhere. And even if there were, it's not obvious how you would get it for your patient. I think there will be a little bit of resistance. I mean, we have a ketamine clinic in Oxford, and the young psychiatrists are thinking, oh, this is like interesting, I could learn a skill here. So there'll be a bit of lag, but I think people would take it up. I think the biggest difficulty is you'll come and see your GP, and your GP just won't be able to do about it. Yeah. So, I mean, there's they have to think about a different sort of, maybe sort of light touch, liaison type healthcare that we don't have a lot of in the UK at the moment.
I think this is, I was having an earlier conversation, this is where I actually think digital will actually sort of complement that, because from a scalability standpoint, you're gonna have to leverage some type of digital solution, especially if you're monitoring these patients for a period of time. Because otherwise, it's not possible.
Do you want to talk a little bit, because we've heard, well, certainly I've heard a lot about wearables and monitoring for people with more serious mental illness, schizophrenia, let's say, particularly in relation to relapse prevention, things like that, and adherence. Do you want to say something about monitoring people, digital monitoring for mood disorders and more common problems, anxiety perhaps?
Well, I'm actually going to give a personal story, if that's okay, and then I'll sort of link it back. So about 4 months ago, I actually had a health scare. But in some ways, being part of Otsuka, I actually had an executive health checkup that happens every year. So I went in December, January, and they said, hey, I think you have some issues. Let's just take a look at it. There's been a change in your baseline. They went in, and about 15 minutes later, they said you need a double bypass heart surgery. And I didn't have any existing conditions. I didn't have any, or at least anything that I knew. And I went in for the surgery, and I pushed back a little bit on the traditional path, and I said, I work in digital, let's think about a robotic surgery. I said, I don't know if I can go back and not say I took the path there, and I was at University of Pennsylvania, and they said, well, we haven't done a double bypass heart surgery using robotics. Well, I said, let's give it a shot at this point. My wife wasn't very happy with that message, but it was something that I had to do. And at that point, one of the things that was really sort of going through my mind was, it was sort of the diagnosis. It was actually seeing some change in data that actually triggered that. Being able to sort of do a robotic surgery was sort of important to me, just being able to sort of be in the space, but it actually allowed recovery much quicker. But I thought what was the most important part was coming out of the recovery, it was sort of the mental health side that was a struggle. Because again, you're sort of, the surgery's done, they take care of everything, and then you're sort of just in that mindset. being at University of Penn, they actually asked a question every single day, and they were going through that notion of really being able to sort of, work through you. And within about a week and a half, I was at home and I went to work. I just couldn't sit at home because just being able to sort of go through that mental side. And I think for me, it was the personalization, because everyone else probably would have taken a different path. But for me, just being able to sort of just keep my mind busy was allowing me to sort of go through that. And I think it was really the diagnosis, being able to see a change, really being able to treat it in a way that was unique to me. And sort of coming out of that allowed me to sort of be here and sort of, go through the normal day-to-day. And to answer your question, I think it has to be sort of the data that tells the story to be able to go through it. But again, how you personalize what each one of us is going through from a mental standpoint is going to be based upon the individual and being able to sort of answer questions and going through those moments. But for me, it was extremely important to just recognize that, just being in mental health and sort of being in digital, that's there. But I had access to things that most people probably wouldn't have, and sort of thought about, what about the rest of the individuals that don't have access to this type of treatment, and being able to go through that. And I think that's where I do think digital data, wearables, and other types of diagnosis is going to help, but I'm not sure if that's something that's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. I just think the data is just not there.
So let's have a think, because you brought very nicely together some of the things that Kathryn was saying about, lack of access is a problem from her perspective. And then Vanessa talking about, well, only about a third of people, at least a third of people wouldn't want to have a psychedelic, for example, and it might not suit people. And I was involved with Malcolm Lader. Some of you may know Malcolm Lader, pharmacologist at the Institute of Psychiatry for many years, and he got involved in this huge class action in the 90s for people who at Maudsley were treated with LSD in the same way that ketamine and the psychedelics are being used now. And they were bringing a class action then, which they won in the high courts for long-term damage, as they saw it as a result of their trip. Now, things might have moved on, but I suppose we come back to our original point that there isn't a small molecule or a cell or a target in quite the same way that we have in other disorders. And so these notions of brain chemistry and circuitry with PET scans and networks and all of this kind of stuff, it's pretty much a shot in the dark still, hence my desire to randomize care. But I wonder, is there a way, an opportunity with this enormous heterogeneity that we're aware of, with these enormous groups, bearing in mind we've got high numbers globally as well as locally, is there a way that we can harness some of those things using digital, using deeply phenotyped cohorts, to, for example, improve and really do come to some form of personalization for something like mood disorder? Mike, can I start with you, because I know you're sort of deeply involved with this, with the Goals program at the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of types of data that would be really useful, and that includes, in terms of phenotyping, that we need to collect in order to start answering that question. And I guess I'm not going to say very much about it, other than just trying to suggest like the broad range of things that you might want to think about with that. So there's sort of clinical measures, symptomatic measures as well. There's the social circumstance, there's whether you're working, there's who you're living with, all that sort of stuff. There's your general physical health, but then your BMI is clearly linked to our last talk, is clearly important. Inflammatory markers, the genetics, all that sort of stuff. So it's, like I said before, it's a dappled causality. It's kind of quite broad. None of these carry the day in and of themselves as a very strong cause in a very large group of patients. But if we are going to personalize and subtype people at all successfully, beyond our ability to do it at the moment, which is a little limited, then we'll have to collect that broad type of data from a large sample.
And when you're talking about large samples, what kinds of numbers do you think we would need for those approaches to be able to be used, for example, in innovative trial design platforms, for example?
So we'd need tens of thousands, I would guess. Yeah.
And of course, that is feasible these days. We really do have the capacity to do that, not just within UK, for example, and linked to other data sets, but also with things like EU Pearl and the international collaborations. Absolutely, those are the kinds of numbers. It's been done with GWAS. Those kinds of numbers have been collected, and for these more deeply phenotyped, both in terms of the omic phenotyping, but also in terms of the clinical phenotyping. And I'm not just talking about cross-sectional, but longitudinal phenotyping. That's what we really need. These are long-term illnesses, most of these. Andrew, can I bring you in here and just, if you like, just think about what you see the opportunities might be for dealing with the heterogeneity?
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but data saved your life.
Data did.
And so why can't we scale that? I was just trying to ask AI what the share of wearables market was for Apple and Google and our own Fitbit. Who here has a wearable and has it on their arm right now? Okay, about 40% of the audience. So we can augment the audience, and if we had a live feed of what you were feeling, we might know, we could predict disease and all those sort of things. What I wonder is what is, for example, Apple's view on what are they doing with health, because they've put a lot of money into the Apple Watch. Whenever it comes out, there's all these glossy presentations. I don't know that I've read about what they're doing with that data, and I think it could be very, very rich, and a company like Apple may want to hold it together, but imagine if you could share that. Last time I saw my GP, I showed him my then Fitbit data, and he said, I can't do anything with that. The fact that you saw an increase in your weight is good, but I can't do anything with the raw data. So I had to interpret it. That was a few years ago. So I'm just wondering, should we be interrogating these large companies that have access to the data in a closed environment? Are they running trials? Can they put some of their data towards saving lives?
Perhaps a good point to bring in Tony, who's been trying to get my attention for a while.
Just from the point of view of somebody who watches the field, because as you can imagine, my constant challenge is what do I choose to invest in and what don't I? And as we're looking at neurodegeneration, we're starting to come across technologies like task-focused dry electrode EEG. And I wonder, because when I look at the area, it's dappled, it's plastic in terms of response rates, it's situationally dependent in terms of response rates. These are all the confounders that I run away from when I'm trying to construct that data tower that I was talking about earlier. And for me then, it needs a different analytical paradigm. If you had something that under task focus could report out various response domains that's challengeable with a pharmacopoeia from the past, for example. I just wonder how you're thinking about that. Does this just really need a paradigm shift in how we qualify the phenotype?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of work going on, I think, in this area.
In the girls' program.
Yeah. But also, I think you mentioned, rather than just a cohort of people that you follow, looking at the induced changes early on in treatment with the standard treatment. So there's quite a lot of work in that area. And some SMEs, that's your USP, right? They're saying, we're developing this in order to do it. So it's the goal. It hasn't, it's not, you'll know the market's not full of successful companies that have been able to do that so far. But I think one of the ways that you can reduce the heterogeneity is, rather than looking just at the baseline or the first year of like a massive group of folk with depression, is to look at the change over maybe the first week of treatment or something like that. And then some of those metrics are potentially clinically actionable.
So yes, and I also think that we've got a huge opportunity with the data sets that we already have to look at treatment success with different phenotypes. So what the Goals program is currently doing is using linked primary and secondary care data. So we've got 38 million in that relatively small CPRD Aurum sample linked to their secondary care data, plus quite a lot of other information. And you can, if you like, test out. Pharma are interested in a core symptom of mood disorder, anhedonia, inability to enjoy things you would normally enjoy. And it is a real feature that makes people, well, it's about being miserable, isn't it? We've all sort of felt, I feel miserable, don't try and cheer me up. Anyway, that kind of thing. And, so the idea is that could you have a molecular target for something like anhedonia? Could you sort of isolate something within something as complex as mood disorders? And the conversation goes back and forth, and where we're at really, I think, with them at the moment is, rather than trying to just isolate and have a new target as anhedonia, which would cause lots of polypharmacy, because everywhere you treat for anhedonia, then you treat for sleep, and then you treat for the whatever, is that you then look at how anhedonia might cluster for different people at different stages of their mood disorder over time with other sets of symptoms, and use treatments more in a more informed way. And I think just coming back to the sort of reticence of clinicians and indeed patients in relation to some new treatments and the medicalization of mental health is that, people feel that they don't want to just take a drug for how they feel. But if they felt, because they know how complicated how they feel really is, but if they felt that this medicine was actually taking into account far more about how that individual is and where they are in their sort of mood disorder, then I think would be much easier for us to persuade people that, psychedelics may not be for everybody, but they could be really for you right now. It may not be something you're always going to take, but it might be at this point, then followed by some form of psychotherapy might be really helpful now. And I think that kind of information is going to be valuable for the future.
The other key ingredient in the development pathway is co-production, and making sure that patients as partners are there right the way through the development pathway, and are there as scientists and as leaders and as champions of it. And that will give much better credibility to the whole process, and how data is used, and the trust issues and the integrity and all the other things that we know that go into the kind of frameworks that we work with, but nothing about us without us.
I totally agree with you, and that's why all of these cluster analyses are being done with patients saying what the important sets of symptoms.
Because a lot of work now is being done with patients actually doing the synthesis work, so whether it's in systematic reviews or you report your patient-reported outcome measures, and then patients can help to synthesize and work out what might be going on. So, and skilling people up. The other part of it is training programs. You don't just suddenly get to be able to do these things. So somebody said earlier the importance of investment in this kind of work. So the public engagement, public involvement work needs a skilled workforce, and that needs investment and it needs time. And so that's the other part of the development pathway, and moving into industry, doing that as well as through the public funders.
And just one more plug for the Mental Health Goals Programme. We have a lived experience industry partnership, which you're aware of and you will be a part of course, and that is proper percentage of investment across the piece. So we really hope to take you on that. A question over there. Do you have a microphone? Do you want to borrow mine?
No.
Just say who you are.
Thank you. My name is Rom. Quick question. I mean, we operating in the field of healthcare. We talk a lot about data, technology, which obviously are very helpful tools. However, in the realm of mental health, which is inherently a human problem, don't you think we are focusing way too much on technology-driven solution to address something that is a human problem? I mean, the 21st century has brought us technology beyond whatever we could have, hoped for 20 years ago, including AI. But still, people, especially in economically advanced countries, are getting more miserable, and the stats show that the suicide rate is particularly high in countries like Europe, US, so technically countries where we should be happier because we have access to pretty much everything, technology, etc. So the French writer André Malraux said, the 21st century will be spiritual or won't be at all. And we still aren't getting better. So as professionals operating in the realm of mental health, do you think we should be investing more resources, time, and efforts in trying to make a difference at the community level, education to sensibilize people, teachers, physicians, families, children, to treat and prevent depression, as opposed to act on it with technology-driven solution?
I would say 100% yes. And we obviously know that the harms of social media, like there's benefits and the harms, drive the latest survey in the UK showing people are more lonely, more isolated. So everything that you said, I absolutely agree. When you ask people, it's a human we're human, humanist, compassion, and building. It comes back to, I think somebody said this morning, what kind of world do we want to live in? How do we want to connect with each other? How important are the relationships that we have with each other? So there's a place for everything, but at the end of the day in mental health, the human connection and compassion, it drives healthcare, drives the relationships within our families, within our communities. And like you say, across the whole globe. It's not just within Europe, but in all countries.
AI will never feel emotion or love. So we still need the humans and just need to be aware of that. It is not a replacement.
Do you want to make any comments about the clinical perspective?
No, I might push back a little bit about that, if that's okay. So in a sense, I agree with you. And I think if you wanted to do one thing that improved the mental health of the UK most generally, you'd just improve the economy, right? So
we know that.
So GSK can help the UK by simply investing in us, right? There you go. Never mind it. So there's no there's no doubt about that. But mental ill health and these like depression, schizophrenia, and stuff. There are a lot of people that suffer really quite acutely and that are helped by the pharmacological or neurostimulatory techniques that we use. And I think patients are reasonably sophisticated, right? They don't think, I'm going to take this pill and my whole life will be great. They think, I'm going to take this pill, it's going to give me these side effects, but on balance, I think it's probably worth it and it's helping me a little bit to do it. So it clearly, and I think probably in healthcare we should limit the areas of life that we try and improve. And I'm not very good at helping people's spirituality, right? So I don't think I should be involved in that. But I think there is a role for psychotherapy and drugs that help people. And so I don't think we should lose sight of that in the morass and complexity of mental illness.
Thanks very much. We've got a question at the back.
Hi. I just wanted to know what you thought about, obviously there's been an increasing amount of research suggesting that several neurodegenerative disorders are caused by gut issues, and more specifically the microbiome. I wanted to ask what your opinion was that disorders of the brain or neurological disorders are actually a symptom of, for example, dysbiosis as opposed to a disease in themselves.
Great question, very modern question. Anyone want to address that?
Can I address that? So I'll say that. So I think there's some really interesting research some of my colleagues are working on at the moment. I'm a pretty skeptical person generally. When I see a good RCT where that actually works prospectively, then I'll be pretty convinced. I haven't seen that yet. And so I hope it's right. And I don't think it's one or the other, right? It's because these problems are caused by a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
And if that's one of the things we can target, we've just finished a trial of the ketogenic diet, actually, right? So in that area. So I really hope it works. I haven't seen the evidence yet. And I think a randomized trial, I know you guys like observational data, but randomization really talks, would convince me.
So yes, just quickly, the Sanger Institute, just down the road, has a huge program of work on the microbiome and mental health. There is, in the Goals program, a new birth cohort. I'm not so convinced about a new birth cohort, but at least this birth cohort has taken microbiome data from both infant and mother and will continue longitudinally. So questions? Yes, question here, sorry. And then you next. Oh, okay, fine. Why don't you start? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lee. I'm the CEO of a research charity called Action Against AMD. I just wanted to ask whether the panel knows more about this new science that is emerging of oculomics, where you can actually image several systemic conditions through the retina. And I'm mentioning this because it is quite a lot of different linkage studies showing relation to neurodegeneration or so, but it's much more of a challenge to link this to mental health data sets, right? And then the second side of this is we talk about a lot of technologies here. For instance, your activity monitors. Those are at the edge. And some of our colleagues still rely on a lot of the mental health research on data on very expensive secondary care MRI, CT scanners. So I'm thinking about community level, eye scan, retinal scan to do that edge research. Something for the panel.
Great question. Andrew, do you want to answer that?
That's not way above my pay grade, that one.
Anybody else?
I don't know much about.
Do you know about this?
If the data's there, interested to hear about
I
it.
mean, I sat next to somebody at a welcome event who was an American company developing the retinal and oculomics, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and I wanted the name of his company so I could invest in it when it went onto the stock market. I mean, I think there are all sorts of people. There's another person who was looking at also some form of oral stimulation as opposed to, getting data through the retina. But I think there is a whole world out there of relatively non-invasive, low-cost and scalable solutions that we really need to consider, particularly for these common mental disorders. I'm a big fan of near-infrared spectroscopy. It's portable. You can image infants. It doesn't matter if they're moving. You can, the MRC has rolled it out in field hospitals in the Gambia. I mean, there are lots of these. We need tractable, low-cost imaging, tractable, low-cost measurement. I think it's going to be really fantastic for mental health.
70% of the optometrists on High Street have the equipment already.
You're selling me. Now, young woman here, and then... last question, sorry.
I have two in one, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
I'm saying that I have two in one, if that's okay. I mean, my first one is really in the preventative kind of like a stage. We all know that the mental health, I mean, it's not, developed in a day. There has been, most of the time, especially, in adolescents, in teenagers, there has been years and years until that they are seeking that kind of like, they have symptoms and they finally go through the pathway. Just wonder kind of what's your view in prevention? And if I may also ask in terms of technology, you talk about AI being a tool which, a lot of young people, they turn to talk to them, which is great. Of course, that's a channel for them to talk to. But we also know that technology is a problem as well. Kind of we see all of the social media and they don't actually connect with the actual world. Do you see a danger in them? They rely on that rather than, kind of seeking help. Thank you.
Well, I'm a technologist, but I understand technology is dangerous. What's interesting is social media, probably 15 years since it was introduced. The government's only recently woken up. They need to start to regulate it. Within 12 months of ChatGPT being launched, there was an AI safety summit in the UK. So the government realises that AI has some risks, but they didn't do the same around social media. I don't know how to solve the social media problem. I think it will be generational. I think I'm hearing that Gen Alpha and Beta that are turning 10, 5 and 15 respectively, they are staying off it. They're going outside getting their hands dirty like I did as a kid and playing and making up stories because they've seen the harm.
The Australian government is limiting it to school.
That will have a limited impact. Kids know how to get around Wi-Fi codes everywhere.
Okay, I think we need to bring it to an end, even though we're only 2 minutes over our actual allocated time. But it's been a real pleasure. I've learned a huge amount. I hope you have too. Thank you so much for all of your participation.